Hello, my name is Ayoka Chenzira. My friends call me Ayo. You can call me Ayo. I'm an independent filmmaker based in Atlanta, Georgia. I get so many letters from people asking me why I became a filmmaker, what are some of my inspirations, where do I get my material from. So I've made this short video that will hopefully answer some of your questions. I hope that you enjoy it. I do remember my mother purchasing my first camera when I was 17 years old. We went downtown to Philadelphia to a store and the salesman was very confused. Here my mother was, a single woman who had a child who was on her way to New York to study filmmaking, and she was paying cash for the camera. He couldn't wrap his head around all of this, but while he was scratching his head, I was off on a train from Philadelphia to New York to study filmmaking with my first Super 8 camera. There's probably no straight line that led me to filmmaking, but the two things that stand out in my mind are growing up in my mother's beauty parlor and being exposed to movies on a regular basis. Now the first one, growing up in my mother's beauty parlor, my mother had a spectacular beauty parlor in Philadelphia where women came to get their hair done, nails done, everything did. It was an extraordinary place because women from the community came and shared their life stories, their hopes, their dreams, their expectations, and it's probably the first place that I remember listening to stories every day for an extended period of time. And these weren't just any stories. These women would tell these stories in full character, full body expression, full voice expression. It was almost like being in a mini theater. And then the second thing I think is that my mother really, really loved movies. And she took me to the movies on a regular basis. And at that time, the movie theaters were kind of these palatial spaces. And the films were on these gigantic screens, and there was even an intermission. Her love for the movies was infectious, and by the time I was 17 years old, I decided that I wanted to be a filmmaker, even though I didn't have a clue about how to make movies. Sometimes stories find me, and I know that that's probably an odd thing to understand, but sometimes stories just come to you and they ride you until you can put the pieces together. Other times I'm just scribbling on napkins. I'm a big scribbler, and in fact, I write out thoughts and ideas on napkins more than I do in my own journal. I'll sit in a restaurant for hours just like scribbling. It's this kind of form of meditation in many ways for me. And so eventually my household of napkins comes together and I begin to construct stories. But stories aren't always inspired by what I write in terms of text. Sometimes a story is inspired by a photograph that I've taken or a drawing that I've made. Sometimes it's a location that I've been in or a color that I've seen or the shape of something really interesting that I've seen might spark an idea for a story. But mostly, as my husband would tell you, there's napkins all over the house that eventually form this wonderful collage, and I begin to rewrite, write, reimagine, and eventually a story is born. For me, there's no question that centralizing the voices and the lived experiences of Black women around the world is as important today as it was when I first began making films 30 years ago. I hadn't really thought much about the signatures as it relates to my work, but I think if you put my body of work together, obviously, as I've mentioned previously, what comes to the foreground is the lived experiences of Black women, and also my interest in experimenting with the moving image as it relates to the technology and also where that moving image is displayed. My work has been shown in film festivals on traditional movie screens, on television, but also my work has been embedded in sculptures or has appeared in theatrical work or within a gaming context. When I first began making films, I was trained to be a film snob. What this means is that film, as in celluloid, was the most important thing that one could have as a filmmaker in terms of using cameras that captured an image on celluloid. But I also was being trained at a time when video was coming out, and video by film snobs like me was considered like just a degraded image that you couldn't do much with. When I began to realize that stories require different kinds of palettes to make you feel particular ways about the story, video then became one of the tools in my bag, a way of thinking about cinema not just as kind of clean, high-resolution images, but to think about how those images could be elastic and look different and not just made in post-production, but actually made while you were shooting. These days, the computer has become another important tool that I use for the construction of storytelling. Recently, I did a project called Her Adventure, which is part linear film, but the second part of it is a game, and that game uses computer programming as a way to unfold the story as you interact with it. So my interest in technology remains, and I'm laughing because friends who know me know that I'm very interested in technology, and they tease me a lot about this. I was a curious child. I wanted to know what was on the other side of the mountain, what was on the other side of the river. And eventually, when I started making films, and my films were in festivals all around the world, I began to meet the most extraordinary people, many of whom have remained friends to this day. So my filmmaking is taking me on not just a professional journey, but a personal journey that has been very rewarding. Well, by the time I enrolled at NYU in the film program in the 70s, I was already steeped in storytelling. I had already seen a lot of films, including films from other countries, and I had been exposed to a lot of different art forms. I took ballet lessons, modern lessons, piano lessons. I studied the cello. I was exposed to opera. My mother made beautiful clothes, and so I had a lot of art traditions in me. But I think that my mother in many ways remains my greatest inspiration because she was really big on exposure. I didn't grow up wealthy. We didn't have a lot of money, although I didn't know that until I was an adult. But what I do know is that it was important to my mother to expose me to things that were of interest to her. And she believed that art was very important, and also knowing how to make something was very important. I don't know that I have any great advice. I mean, the filmmaking world today is different than the filmmaking world that I grew up in, and I am very aware of that. I mean, the good news is that depending on your story and how you approach it, your film could cost a lot less money. There's a lot more options, digital cameras with interchangeable lenses, mobile phones. But I think still the key is people. Who's on your team, putting the right people on the bus. It seems that now it's important to have people on your team that have more than one skill, who can be very nimble and very fluid. And it's also equally important to have people who are very specific about what they do and do that extremely well. Probably too, the biggest advice is don't get your feelings hurt when people tell you no. You're probably going to hear no more than you hear yes. So stay committed to your own dream and your own vision, and just hang in there and do your work. Your audience and the world will eventually catch up with you.